Hey guys, tonight we're talking about medieval daily life, also known as being in pain and pretending that's normal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval people did not wake up feeling refreshed. There was no rise and shine because nothing was shining, and rising felt like a personal insult. They woke up already injured, not in a dramatic lawsuit-worthy way, but in the deeply inconvenient long-term way that never improves and has no exciting story attached to it. Beds were part of the problem. The medieval bed was usually a wooden frame topped with a sack of straw that had been sat on, slept on, and emotionally given up on years earlier. If the straw was fresh, it poked you. If it was old, it had collapsed into strange shapes that targeted your spine with surgical precision. Pillows were rare. Mattresses were a rumor. Comfort was not a priority. Survival had budget constraints. Sitting up triggered the first wave of negotiations with your body. Knees crackled like old floorboards. Backs stiffened immediately as if protesting the audacity of movement. Necks turned only halfway before filing a formal complaint. None of this caused alarm. If you woke up without pain, that was concerning. It suggested illness, youth, or suspicious levels of wealth. Cold added a special layer of cruelty. Winter mornings meant muscles that felt frozen into place, fingers that refused to cooperate, and joints that responded to movement with sharp reminders of yesterday's poor decisions. That first step out of bed was a gamble. Sometimes your legs held. Sometimes they reminded you that you carried grain sacks yesterday and would be carrying them again today, whether you liked it or not. Pain did not reset overnight. There was no sleep-it-off pain stacked like unpaid taxes. Yesterday's soreness joined last week's strain, which teamed up with an injury from years ago that never healed correctly, and now made surprise appearances during weather changes. Medieval bodies aged aggressively. By 30, many people moved like modern retirees who had angered their chiropractor. And yet, no one lingered in bed. Staying down didn't reduce pain. It only delayed work. Animals still needed feeding. Fires needed tending. Fields waited patiently. Pain was not a valid excuse. It was simply the default setting. There wasn't even language for chronic pain. There was just life. Nobody asked how you felt because the answer was obvious. Of course you hurt. Everyone did. The only real question was whether you could still stand up and keep going. So medieval mornings didn't begin with coffee or motivation. They began with pain, familiar, unavoidable, and already penciled into the day's schedule. If medieval mornings began with back pain, they quickly escalated to mouth pain. Toothaches weren't a medical issue. They were a low lifestyle. Almost everyone had at least one tooth that hurt constantly, throbbed randomly, or flared up whenever the weather changed, which in medieval times was always. Dental hygiene as a concept did not exist. Teeth were cleaned accidentally, usually by eating coarse bread that scraped them like sandpaper. Sugar wasn't the problem yet. Survival was. Cracked teeth, worn enamel, and exposed nerves were common. Cavities formed slowly and then announced themselves dramatically, usually in the middle of the night when pain has the most personality. Infection was frequent. Abscesses swelled under the jaw, creating faces that looked permanently annoyed. Pus drained. Pain radiated into the ear, the eye, the soul. And yet people carried on because stopping work due to dental pain was considered deeply impractical. You could still walk. You could still lift things. Therefore, you were fine. There were treatments technically. Herbs were chewed. Cloves were held against aching teeth. Alcohol was applied generously both to the mouth and to the person. When pain became unbearable, extraction was an option performed by barbers, blacksmiths, or anyone confident enough to own pliers. Anesthesia consisted of holding still and rethinking your life choices. Sometimes the tooth came out cleanly, sometimes it shattered, sometimes the infection spread. This was viewed as unfortunate but not shocking. Medical risk was part of the experience. Complaining didn't improve outcomes, and pain was seen as something to be endured quietly, preferably without disturbing others. Tooth loss was common by early adulthood. Missing teeth weren't stigmatized, they were expected. A full set of teeth was suspicious. It suggested either youth or divine favoritism. By middle age, most people had gaps, worn stubs, or teeth that technically existed, but served no functional purpose beyond reminding you they were there. And the pain never really stopped. It dulled. It ebbed. It flared without warning. People learned to eat on one side of their mouth, to avoid certain textures, to accept that sharp jolts of pain were just part of chewing. Meals weren't about pleasure. They were about survival and careful positioning. In medieval life, tooth pain wasn't something you dealt with. It was something you incorporated into your personality. After waking up sore and enduring a mouth that felt actively hostile, medieval people placed their feet on the ground, and the suffering continued immediately. Feet were the unsung heroes of medieval pain. They carried bodies everywhere all day on surfaces that ranged from frozen mud to jagged stone, and they received absolutely no gratitude for it. Shoes, when they existed, were thin, stiff, and shaped more like an insult than footwear. They had no cushioning, no arch support, and no concept of left or right. Many were hand-me-downs, patched repeatedly, and only vaguely related to the size of the foot inside them. Walking long distances in these was not exercise. It was a slow negotiation between skin, bone, and regret. Blisters were constant. They formed, burst, scabbed over, and reopened in a neat little cycle that never ended. Cuts from stones and frozen ruts were common, as were bruises from dropped tools, livestock stepping where they shouldn't, and life in general. None of this was considered injury. It was simply what happened when you used your feet for survival. In winter, things escalated. Cold crept in through thin leather and cracked seams, numbing toes until they burned, then burned until they went numb again. Frostbite wasn't rare. It was seasonal. Losing feeling in your toes was expected. Losing toes entirely was unfortunate, but not shocking. Limping through winter was normal. Limping permanently was a milestone. Infection was the quiet threat beneath it all. Open sores meant dirty. Cleaning was minimal. Painful swelling and redness were ignored until they physically prevented walking. And even then, people often pushed through. A foot that hurt but still worked was considered functional. By adulthood, most people walked with a slight limp, uneven stride, or careful gait designed to minimize pain. This wasn't a disability. It was adulthood. Children learned early to toughen their feet, to accept soreness as part of movement, and to stop reacting dramatically to pain that wasn't immediately life-threatening. And yet medieval people walked constantly to fields, to markets, to churches, to neighboring villages. There was no alternative. If your feet failed, your life shrank instantly. So people endured the pain, adjusted their pace, and carried on. In medieval times, healthy feet didn't mean pain-free feet. They meant feet that still worked despite everything done to them. Medieval pain wasn't always sharp or dramatic. Often it was quiet, persistent, and located directly in the stomach. Hunger was not an emergency state. It was the default setting. Medieval people did not expect to feel full ever. Feeling satisfied after a meal was a rare, suspicious sensation, usually followed by the realization that you would be paying for it later. Food existed, but abundance did not. Diets were repetitive, limited, and heavily dependent on the season. Bread made up the bulk of calories, and even that was often coarse, gritty, and aggressively stale. Vegetables were eaten when available. Meat appeared occasionally, like a guest who never stayed long enough to make an impression. As a result, hunger pains were constant. Not the dramatic starvation you see in disasters, but a dull, hollow ache that lived quietly in the background of daily life. A gnawing reminder that your body was operating on minimum resources. People learned to work through it. Hunger wasn't something you fixed. It was something you managed, like a bad knee or a tooth that hurt when it rained. Meals were planned around survival, not enjoyment. Portions were small. Second helpings were theoretical. Children grew up knowing the feeling of hunger so well that it stopped registering as pain and became a sensation like thirst or fatigue. Inconvenient, but familiar. During hard years, hunger intensified. Poor harvests, bad weather, war or illness could push people from constant hunger into real starvation. But even then, there was little room for panic. You couldn't stop working because you were hungry. In fact, hunger often meant you needed to work more, which was deeply unfair, but rarely questioned. Hunger also affected the body in subtle ways. Dizziness was common. Weakness was expected. People fainted occasionally and then got back up mildly embarrassed. A lack of nutrients led to brittle bones, sore joints, and slow healing. More pain layered on top of existing pain, quietly reinforcing itself. And yet, medieval people developed coping strategies. They drank watered-down ale for calories. They stretched meals with fillers. They ate things modern people would politely refuse. Hunger shaped habits, priorities, and even morality. Waste was a sin, not because it was unethical, but because it physically hurt to imagine throwing food away. In medieval life, good hunger wasn't a crisis. It was a companion, ever-present, dull, and entirely unremarkable. If hunger was the background hum of medieval life, back pain was the soundtrack. It began early, escalated quickly, and never truly left. Medieval people didn't develop back pain. They inherited it from childhood like an unwanted family tradition. Work started young. Children carried water, gathered firewood, hauled baskets, and helped in the fields long before their bodies had any business doing so. There was no concept of growing pains. Pain meant you were useful. If a child could lift something, they were expected to lift it repeatedly, daily, and without complaint. By adolescence, backs were already compromised. Spines bent forward slightly from constant labor, muscles hardened unevenly. Posture adjusted itself around pain, creating new pain in the process. By adulthood, most people moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned exactly which motions hurt the least. The work itself was relentless. Lifting sacks of grain, carrying water in heavy buckets balanced on yokes, digging frozen soil, threshing, harvesting, stacking, loading. Everything involved bending, twisting, lifting, and holding weight in deeply unhelpful positions. And there were no breaks in the modern sense. You stopped when the light failed or when your body physically refused to continue, whichever came last. There was no treatment, no stretching routines, no ergonomic advice. If your back hurt, you adjusted your grip, shifted the load, or leaned slightly to one side and hoped that solved it. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. A bad back wasn't diagnosed. It was acknowledged briefly and then ignored. Severe injuries happened. Slipped discs, crushed vertebrae, pulled muscles that never healed correctly. People worked through them because not working wasn't an option. A person who couldn't lift was a burden, and being a burden was more dangerous than pain. By middle age, many people were visibly hunched, not from age alone, but from years of adaptation. The spine learned to curve to protect itself. Pain dictated posture. Pain shaped movement. Pain became the silent architect of the medieval body. And yet, no one thought this was unusual. A straight, pain-free back wasn't the goal. Function was. If you could still carry, bend, and work even slowly, you were considered healthy. In medieval life, back pain wasn't a condition. It was proof you had survived long enough to earn it. In medieval life, injuries didn't announce themselves with drama. They arrived, quietly, settled in, and refused to leave. Small cuts, scrapes, splinters, and burns were part of daily existence. So common they barely registered as injuries at all. If you waited for your skin to be unbroken before working, you would never work. Hands were the worst. They were constantly exposed to tools, rough wood, thorns, rope, metal, and the occasional angry animal. Knuckles were cracked, fingers were nicked, palms carried old scars layered on top of new ones, like a personal injury scrapbook nobody asked for. A hand without cuts was either suspicious or belonged to a child who hadn't been useful yet. These wounds didn't heal quickly. Cleanliness was minimal. Bandages were improvised, and the idea of keeping a wound sterile had not yet occurred to anyone. Dirt entered cuts daily. So did manure, dust, and whatever else happened to be nearby. Pain flared, subsided, and then returned when the wound was reopened by more work. Burns were equally normal. Cooking over open flames meant scorched fingers, singed arms, and the occasional serious burn when a pot tipped or embers escaped. Burn scars were common and unremarkable. If someone complained about a burn, the usual response was a glance and a nod. Yes, that happens. Infection was the unspoken threat behind every injury. Redness, swelling, warmth, and pain were watched with mild concern. If the wound still allowed movement, it was ignored. Only when a limb stopped functioning did alarm set in, and by then it was often too late. Amputation existed, but it was drastic, dangerous, and often fatal in itself. Most wounds simply lingered. They scabbed over, cracked open, scabbed again, and slowly formed scars that thickened the skin and dulled sensation. Pain didn't disappear. It became familiar. People learned which cuts hurt worse in the cold, which burned when wet, and which should not be bumped under any circumstances. Children learned early not to cry over small injuries. Crying didn't fix the cut, and attention was better saved for emergencies. A scraped knee earned sympathy for about 3 seconds. Then it was time to keep moving. In medieval times, wounds weren't treated as temporary setbacks. They were long-term companions, and pain was simply the body reminding you that you were still using it. Medieval cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was invasive. It didn't stop at the skin. It moved inward, settled into joints, and made itself at home. Cold-induced pain wasn't an occasional problem. It was a seasonal identity. Houses offered very little protection. Walls leaked air, roofs leaked snow, and fires were small, smoky, and never quite enough. When winter arrived, fingers stiffened first, then toes, then ears, noses, and anything else that stuck out into the world with unfortunate confidence. Numbness was common. Burning pain followed. People learned to accept both without comment. Cold pain showed up in stages. At first, there was the sharp sting, fingers aching as they worked in freezing air, skin cracking until it bled. Then came the dull ache, a deep soreness in joints that never fully warmed again. Knees protested, wrists throbbed. Old injuries resurfaced like ghosts with unfinished business. Frostbite wasn't rare or dramatic. It was quiet. Skin went pale, sensation faded. Sometimes it returned, sometimes it didn't. Losing feeling in a finger was annoying. Losing the finger itself was unfortunate, but survivable. People adapted. Gloves were crude. Mittens were better, but rare. Most warmth came from movement, which was painful in its own way. Cold also amplified every existing ache. A bad back hurt more. Old cuts throbbed. Tooth pain intensified because of course it did. Winter was when the body reminded you of everything you'd ever done wrong. And unlike today, there was no waiting it out indoors. Work continued. Fields didn't care. Animals still needed attention. The cold didn't pause life. It sharpened it. Sleep offered little relief. Nights were long and freezing. Bodies curled inward trying to conserve heat. Muscles tightened defensively. People woke up stiffer than they went to bed, already bracing for another day of pain. And yet, medieval people rarely described cold pain as suffering. It was simply winter. Complaining about it was like complaining about gravity. Everyone experienced it. Everyone endured it. Those who didn't adapt didn't last. In medieval life, cold wasn't something you avoided. It was something you lived inside. And the pain it caused wasn't exceptional. It was expected, seasonal, and quietly accepted as part of being alive. For medieval women, Pain wasn't an occasional visitor. It was scheduled, and nothing on that schedule compared to childbirth. This was not a dramatic once-in-a-lifetime ordeal. It was a recurring event, expected, unavoidable, and approached with the same resigned attitude as winter or taxes. There was no anesthesia, no pain relief.